I have too much to try to say, so I will either say far too much or not enough. The problematic of racial distinction in its historical elaboration over the course of our common modernity, but especially as it is configured within the history of the inheritance of metaphysics as Greek conceptuality in Europe over the past half millennium. This problematic of race, of racial distinction, as I prefer to call it, has formed, we might say, the political unconscious of my debate with the history of philosophy, a tradition that for the most part has denigrated, if not excluded, the terms of inhabitation of thought on my part. And subsequently, my engagement with deconstruction as a radical elucidation of what is still at stake in that inheritance. Thinking of the delimitation in de la grammatologie, of grammatology, of the epochal limits of the 18th century in Europe, and thinking that which one can place under the heading of the movement of the trace, but even before of grammatology, in the insurgent respect that seems to guide the engagement with Husserl and the introduction to Husserl's Origin of Geometry. Thinking of these references which mark my own itinerary, two historical indices and a coda. One, the normative and disciplining foundational exclusions of the American Constitution. Two, the paradoxes of sovereignty that configure or configured the revolution in Saint Domingue, Haiti. In this context, we must note that we are in the midst of the 200th anniversary of the death of Toussaint Louverture in France. And likewise, in the midst of the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence of the State of Haiti, marked by that shuttling chain from Macandal, and I must mention in proximity here the great Nani, the Maroon leader in Jamaica, Boukman Toussaint, Moise, Dessalines, Christophe, and the enigmatic Sans Souci, the man. An autobiographical note. It was a problematics concerning Marxist thinking of the concept of nature that first led me to the work of Jacques Derrida on the problematic of the sign in general, first, and then to the matter of historicity. It was Du Bois's formulations of the enigmatic figure of the double and thinking the status of the African American that guided me as I began that engagement. So it is that problematic of racial distinction, this one, that has formed the political unconscious, to refer to my senior colleague and friend, Frederick Jemison, of my engagement with deconstruction. A parallel question around Marx is a related but different story. This is all marked by my first meeting and sharing a conversation with Jacques Derrida in 1992 at the University of Chicago during the occasion of his lectures published as Given Time. I acknowledge and thank him for the graciousness of his thoughts at that time. There, the status of the problematic of race and its relation to the oppositional logic of metaphysics were just the opening for a certain vigorous resting in thought, a silence perhaps exorbitant to those very terms. I would also like to thank David Theo Goldberg, who has been for me both a friend, mentor, and fellow traveler. And without saying so much, I'll leave to the space of friendship the importance of that relationship here. I'm going to offer essentially 4 moments, and I'll place them under 4 terms. Desedimentation, which is my preferred term for the problematic that Jacques Derrida began to announce under the heading of deconstruction in the 1960s, and delimitation. And then, in a parallel fashion, but different and specific, what I call hyperracialization and hyperbole, or hyperbolic practice. I think of desedimentation as the breaking up, on the one hand, of the encrusted strata, or even the bedrock, of inherited conceptual structures. And on the other hand, the turning up of new soil on old ground. not, that is, an archaeology or genealogy in the traditional sense. I think of hyperracialization as marking, under the heading of the problematic of race, that enigma, that enigmatic problematic that one must confront in responding to or seeking to overthrow any inheritance that would imprison, limit, or curtail one's freedom in thought or practice. So it is in that frame that I want to propose an outline of the problematic of racial distinction on three different axes. My initial concern here will be to try to formulate the notion of what racial distinction might be understood to be with regards to the history of metaphysics. The frame under which I will do that is the following. Forgive me for I'm shuffling through a number of different thoughts that I want to offer here and try to do so in a brief manner. My interest in engaging the problematic of racial distinction, while not disavowing the problematic of historicization, indeed I'll try to remark that in a moment, I felt that the major problem in thinking through the problematic of racial distinction has been our incapacity to think its general references, its general embeddedness in the history of metaphysics and the infrastructures of our conceptuality. So in terms of elucidating, I might say, a problematic of racial distinction, the first step in what I would call a project of hyperracialization, I would like to outline a few thoughts along that line. What we name under the heading of race, or as I prefer, racial distinction, must be thought, while still maintaining it under the name race, as a far more general problematic than what we typically gather up under that name. One of the ways it is more general, a way that is not one among many, is its ontological status as a movement of difference, in its repetitive form as a relation. In the threshold of ontological difference, then, not as a thing in itself, but a tissue of differences. In one temporality of its repetition, a trace, a sign, but of course as both signifier and signified. In the epistemological sense, as concept, naming an object of thought, it appears as oppositional in its structure, defining something as one thing and not another. In this epistemological sense, this is the absolute premise and ultimate resource of the concept of race. As such, it participates in the dominant, if not most essential thought of Greek conceptuality, metaphysics, philosophy as metaphysics. That is, the concept of the concept, the logic, in logic above all, of the formalization of the ground of being as it shows forth in existence, and knowledge as oppositional in its organization. In terms of our thinking of the history of philosophy, Kant is, I think, emerging more and more as a pivotal figure. The work of Robert Bernasconi, archival and archaeological in this regard, would be signal, but also the work of a scholar like John David Smith in historicizing American letters. In this regard, then, we can follow two different tracks. I would argue that we can think of, or must link, this conceptual reference of the aspect, conceptual reference in the concept of race, or in the problematic of race or racial distinction, to what I might try to call the political, quote unquote, in the large sense, by way of a formulation of what I would call the agonistic structure of the concept as such. This is one threshold contribution announced in Derrida's practice in the 1960s. But parenthetically, let me remark in a pivotal and important way that David Theo Goldberg's work should be singled out, and I mark it in solidarity as tracking the political productions of this philosophical resource of the practice of racial distinction in his book, Racist Culture. With that in mind, I essentially want to find a way to thematize this notion of the agonistic structure of concepts and its relationship to the concept of race. I will quote from a text that I published in '96, a long quotation from Derrida, one of the first texts I encountered in thinking through his discourse. Quote, from an interview in the 1970s, 68, 70, 71. In a classical philosophical opposition, we're not dealing with the peaceful coexistence of a vis-a-vis, but rather with a violent hierarchy. One of the two terms governs the other, axiologically, logically, etc., or has the upper hand. To deconstruct the opposition, first of all, is to overturn the hierarchy at a given moment. To overlook this phase of overturning is to forget the conflictual and subordinating structure of the opposition. Therefore, one might proceed too quickly to a neutralization that in practice would leave the previous field untouched, leaving one no hold on the previous opposition, thereby preventing any means of intervening in the field effectively. We know what always have been the practical, particularly political effects of immediately jumping beyond oppositions and of protests in the simple form of neither this nor that. When I say that this phase is necessary, the word phase is perhaps not the most rigorous one. It is not a question of a chronological phase, a given moment, or a page that one day simply will be turned, in order to go on to other things. The necessity of this phase is structural. It is the necessity of an interminable analysis. The hierarchy of dual oppositions always reestablishes itself. On the other hand, to remain in this phase is still to operate on the terrain of and from within the deconstructed system. By means of this double and precisely stratified, dislodged, and dislodging writing, we must also mark the interval between inversion, which brings low what was high, and the eruptive emergence of a new concept, a concept that can no longer be and never could be included in the previous regime. If this interval, this biface or biphase, can be inscribed only in a bifurcated writing, then it can only be marked in what I would call a grouped textual field. In the last analysis, it is impossible to point it out for a unilinear text or a punctual position, an operation signed by a single author, are all by definition incapable of practicing this interval. So no distinction is neutral, always hierarchical, one term understood to institute the distinction as itself replete or pure, that is, even as a formal structure, one could remark an agonistically derived structure. The concept of race is precisely such a concept. One racial type or category or another, it is the hypothesis of the concept of race that one racial type or category or another is or can be a pure or replete term. This latter term would dominate the distinction, understood to set it in motion to conclude its itinerary, yielding the result that the subordinate term or terms would be understood to have no determining force in the distinction, even as the practical bearing of the distinction would be understood to mark off fundamentally opposed identities. For strategic purposes, both in dialogue and gesture, summarize this as a schematic account of white supremacy, quote unquote. Historically, this is what has remained unthought or is only now becoming centralized in the current debate, but remains under-theorized, particularly in liberal, moral, or political discourse. And it could be brought out even more in critical race theory. New Marxisms have begun to historicize this problematic. I will not rehearse the limits here, although there are some problems in those formulations. The essential question is, how does one think the whole of the system? To think it in a way that is not homogeneous. And I would argue that one could formulate this under the heading that would allow one to think of it as double at least. Let me try to track that slightly differently and add a few thoughts in the midst of this. The question then becomes, how does one respond from a position of subordination or in terms of the figures of subordination within such a system? Briefly and schematically then, simultaneously one to insist on the position, the irreducible necessity of moving from position, and secondly to insist on the irreducible limits, the inessential grounds of any position. I would like to reference briefly two practices in contemporary discourse as a sort of way to bring these thoughts into some contemporary conversation. One, a discourse placed under the heading of racial citizenship, or a new project of race. I'm thinking of the work of Kendall Thomas, who will be here tomorrow, in a recent essay that I saw and commented on about a year ago, and Lonnie Gunier and Gerald Torres in their book, The Miner's Canary, enlisting race, resisting power, transforming democracy, where they call for a political project of race. And I want to place that in proximity to a project that was elaborated in the 1980s and early 90s in Latin American studies, Chicano studies in particular, led by Renato Rosaldo at Stanford, the notion of cultural citizenship, simply to thematize the stakes. The project of cultural citizenship, the notion of culture, a concept I have a problem with, was understood to be an epistemological concept. The project of cultural citizenship was to render it political and to bring out its hidden moral and ethical grounds. The project of racial citizenship, or a project of race, in either Kendall Thomas's formulation or that of Gunier and Torres, seems to me to take a moral and ethical concept in a philosophical or legal sense and to render it political. My own concern would be to bring out its epistemological problematic and thus to show the epistemological bearing of a political intervention. I call such a project hyper-racialization. First from me announced, or it's suggested in 91, 92, in the work of a colleague of mine, a Native American writer, Mourning Dove, in trying to name the complicated ways in which she negotiated her identities. My own formulation follows schematically both the work of Jacques Derrida and W.E.B. Du Bois. In the case of both scholars, we can link it to what has been called the subaltern, although I am hesitant about any nominalization as an absolute term. The idea is to propose a critique and to speak on behalf of the subordinate. This always entails a critique of the position of the superordinate. I think that this needs to be thematized more, the extent to which, for example, all citizenship is racial, all political inhabitation is racial, so forth and so on. Or a question mark, can there be a cultural inhabitation that is not racial? And we can see this in the work of the liberal scholars specifically. Randall Kennedy would be an example et al. Their privilege, even or especially when unspoken, as in Appiah's work, of whiteness as normative, even as the arena of ideology. And I would refer to the work of Kalpana Seshadri Crook's Desiring Whiteness, which desediments this in a Lacanian direction. One cannot not remark the racial mark or distinction. Thus, I would call for what I call re-racialization or hyper-racialization, whose aim is the destabilization of the oppositional distinction of one racial identity from another. That is to say, one cannot say with certainty, I am not X. Affirmative action then would be indefinite. No. It would be until one can no longer say, I am not a black, not a Negro. So it would require a double move, bringing low the high position or privilege of whiteness, insisting on the racial positioning of subordinate as the source of a new political and thus moral vision. One that would transform not only their own position and moral horizon, but that of the superordinate, the white. I turn in that gesture then to the work of W.E.B. Du Bois, and I want to conclude along this axis. Do I have enough time to, about 5 to 10 more minutes? This is a schematic presentation, as you can see, of a much larger horizon of thought, question. I'm going to track Du Bois in what I call a certain kind of rehistoricization of the problematic of race as constitutive of our common nexus, our common colonial nexus, of the historical epoch or epochs of modernity in general, and of the terms by which we try to grapple with this very problematic. Here, Du Bois is crucial and must be juxtaposed with that re-narrativization of modernity involving the heading race by Foucault in the later aspects of his work. And I'm going to be very, very quick. And I'm above all thinking of Du Bois of two texts. Du Bois of Black Reconstruction from 1935, which is on the Civil War and the failure of Reconstruction, And secondly, Du Bois of 1945-46. At the end of the Second World War, the book Color and Democracy on Colonies and Peace. And then in a related fashion, the books are really of the same locution, Africa and the World from 1946. And I want to begin that historicization in the following fashion. Du Bois writes already in 1900 in London as the secretary to the First Pan-African Congress. He writes the phrase that has become his most famous statement: the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. In the second chapter of The Souls of Black Folk of 1903, those lines are followed by the phrase, the Civil War was a phase of this problem. If one then turns to the Civil War as beyond the chronological dates of the 20th century and understand what's at stake in the Civil War, it takes you right back to the foundation of the United States as a separate republic. It takes you back to the 18th century. And in that sense, you're focused on the question of modernity as a whole. In a sense, then, Du Bois's thematization of the problem of modernity is precisely the problem of the color line. And Du Bois goes on to say the relations of the darker peoples of the oceans of Africa and Asia to Europe. For Du Bois in the United States context, his inimitable concept metaphor, the veil, the ineffable historic symbolic structure of racial distinction, is what he would call the problem of the color line that he remarks in that global sense, whose deployment has real and abiding material effects. Whereas Foucault, in Il faut défendre la société, narrates, or Society Must Be Defended, narrates a move from practices of hierarchization to normativity, in which he associates the distinction that the aristocracy would place between themselves and the lower classes as under the heading of race, where he narrates this as a move from hierarchization to that of normativity in the problematics of discipline. Du Bois had already formulated the hierarchical elaboration of normativity. This is a crucial formulation. The hierarchical elaboration of normativity on two paths: the elaboration of racial distinction within Europe, part of which he sees as culminating in the Holocaust, but already marked in the various ways in which the working class is configured by the bourgeoisie, but most fundamentally for Du Bois, between Europe and the rest of the darker folks of the world, what Du Bois will call the color line. And indeed, that hierarchization finds its articulation in that most prominent of colonies in our post-Enlightenment sense, this United States. Let me turn finally in conclusion to a schematic reference to the work of a discourse in colonialism that some of you are familiar with, which is the work of Ranajit Guha and the Subaltern Studies Collective on India. Whereas some, including Foucault, search for a radical exteriority outside, Du Bois already formulated the enigmas of the heterogeneity of the inside. In Guha's classic essay from 1989, Dominance Without Hegemony in his historiography, he speaks at a certain crucial moment of what he calls double meaning, referencing both Lacan and Freud. And he there identifies it with the dichotomy or the difference of a dead past and a living present, in which what is indigenous is the dead past and what is present is foreign. I'm less interested in a stable exteriority to that, which Guha turns toward, to refer to those aspects of colonial Indian society that have not been, quote unquote, penetrated by the hegemonic forces of the colonizing from England, from Britain, than when he speaks of this double register. And I would like to then simply remark that one should thematize the instability in that juncture, in the double, in this configuration of the double. It is in this space that one finds the place by which one can remark, re-articulate the ensemble of hegemonic meanings that are deployed. It is an insistence upon that infinite, incalculable, unstable position within hegemonic thought. Du Bois himself had already thematized this double reference with regards to the African American, beginning at the turn of the century. But for Du Bois, it was not so much a paradox as it was an inhabitation. And Du Bois insisted from one end of the century to the end of his life on a maintenance of an affirmation of the double. And whereas for Guha, it is a concern of a reference toward the old, toward the past, for Du Bois, it is precisely about the new. For Du Bois, the African American under the heading of the double is that which is yet to come, that which has yet to arrive. Under that heading, I would say that Du Bois proposes hyperbolic rereadings of history, re-narrativizations of history. It is in that moment that one encounters the enigmas of affirming someone like Toussaint Louverture, or like Dessalines, or like Christophe, or, as in Du Bois' own case, John Brown. So with that in mind, I'll leave it for conversation to speak further. Thank you very much.